East Asia, China, Japan, and Korea, 1500 to 1800. The Ming Dynasty was the dynasty that ruled China after the Mongolians were overthrown in 1368. The Ming Dynasty lasted from 1368 until 1644. Ming Hongwu, or the Ming Martial Emperor, was the ruling dynasty. Ming emperors would manage to conquer Vietnam, strengthen the Great Wall of China in the north, and make peace with the nomadic tribes that lived in the Gobi Desert. The Ming government was a highly centralized bureaucracy, with officials chosen based on a civil service exam. As you can see from this map, the Ming Dynasty controlled a sizable area, including present-day Vietnam. Yongle was the Ming emperor from 1402 until 1424. He moved the capital to the city of Beijing in 1421 and built the imperial city, also called the Forbidden City, within Beijing. During the reign of Yongle, he sent a sailor named Jing He on 7 voyages of exploration between 1405 and 1433. Jing He explored the coasts of India and East Africa and brought back exotic animals and goods, things like giraffes. A Portuguese fleet arrived in China in 1514. Unfortunately for the Portuguese, they were fairly ill-behaved when they arrived in China and were eventually kicked out of the city of Guangzhou, also known as Canton, for their behavior. The Portuguese were allowed to set up a trade outpost in the city of Macau. The Portuguese brought Christian missionaries with them who began to try to convert the Chinese, while the Portuguese themselves were impressed with ideas from China such as Confucianism. A series of weak rulers led to the eventual decline of the Ming Dynasty in the late 1500s. Corrupt officials, high taxes, and bad harvests led to unrest among the people. One peasant, a man named Li Zicheng, led a peasant revolt in the 1640s. When his men entered the Forbidden City, the last Ming emperor committed suicide, rather than allowing himself to be captured by Li and his followers. Li Zicheng's revolt successfully overthrew the Ming Dynasty, and rather than suffer the dishonor of being captured by Li Zicheng's forces, the last Ming emperor hung himself in his gardens. The Manchus were a farming and hunting people from northeastern China, a region known today as Manchuria. Following Li Zicheng's revolution, they managed to sweep in and conquer the city of Beijing and the rest of China, establishing their own dynasty called the Qing Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty ruled China from 1644 until 1911. The word Qing means pure. The Manchus were a distinct ethnicity within China, with drastically different clothing, culture, language, and styles than the rest of the empire. Manchus were a different ethnicity than most of China. In fact, the Manchus made up about 1% of China's population. When the island of Taiwan rebelled against their rule, the Manchus forced everyone in the area to adopt Manchurian dress and hairstyles, including Q, a hairstyle with a braided pigtail and a shaved forehead. These distinctive styles helped differentiate between people who were loyal to the Qing dynasty and people who were in revolt against it. The distinct clothing and hairstyle of the Manchus set them apart from the rest of the Chinese population. They required all Chinese to dress like they did, including using their hairstyle, which helped blend the two cultures and make the Manchus more acceptable to the mainstream population. The Manchus kept themselves separate from the rest of Chinese society. They were organized into separate military units, called banners, which worked as the main fighting force of the empire. Mainstream Chinese ended up making up about 80% of the lower positions in the government bureaucracy. Manchus controlled almost all of the higher bureaucratic positions, though. But this sharing of power made the transition to Qing rule much easier to deal with. Kangxi was the Qing emperor from 1661 until 1722. He is widely considered to be the greatest ruler in Chinese history. Kangxi was a patron of the arts and scholars. He pacified the western and northern frontiers of China, and he tolerated the presence of Christian missionaries from Europe in his country. Following the death of Kangxi, though, Christianity would be suppressed in China. Here we see the Emperor Kangxi, widely regarded as one of the greatest rulers in Chinese history. Qianlong was the Qing emperor from 1736 until 1795. Unfortunately, as he grew older, he fell under the sway of corrupt government officials, which led to high taxes on the poor, and eventually to revolts. One such revolt was the White Lotus Rebellion, which lasted from 1796 until 1804. The peasants revolted against unfair and corrupt government practices. The White Lotus Rebellion was eventually put down, but it left the Qing dynasty in a very weak state. The Qing dynasty declined just as European merchants were coming in and asking for more trade rights in China. Europeans were confined to the island of Gwangju and could only trade between October and March with specific companies approved by the Chinese government. Nearly 85% of the Chinese population were still farmers between 1500 and 1800. However, we see a massive population increase between 1390 and the end of the 1700s. The population of China was about 80 million in 1390, but by the end of the 1700s was closer to 300 million. This population increase was caused by a period of peace and stability, and by improvements in the food supply, including a faster growing rice. Of course, higher populations also caused problems, such as difficulty in acquiring land. Commercial capitalism is private business based on profit. Commercial capitalism emerged in Europe during the 1600s and 1700s, but not in China, despite a growth in trade and manufacturing there. Middle-class merchants did not have the same freedom in China that they had in Europe, and trade and manufacturing were seen as inferior professions compared to farming. Chinese daily life during the Ming and Qing dynasties was still built around the extended family, and putting the needs of the family ahead of one's own needs. Families were gathered together into collections called clans, related family groups that were linked by a clan council. The clan council made it possible for wealthier families in the clan to help out poorer families. Chinese clans were often quite extensive, including hundreds or even thousands of individuals in distantly related family groups. China was still a patriarchal society, with women dominated by men. Women weren't allowed to get a formal education or to hold a government job. They could not get a divorce or inherit property, though the man could divorce her if she did not produce sons, or he could even take on a second wife if he chose to. One unusual practice during the Ming and Qing dynasties was foot binding. It was a practice among Chinese aristocracy of wrapping a young girl's feet very tightly in strips of cloth, restricting the way that the feet would grow, keeping them very, very small, but also warping and deforming the growth of the foot and making it almost impossible for an individual whose feet had been bound to walk. The next slide contains an image of foot binding, which could be considered fairly disturbing. Don't look at it if you feel uncomfortable looking at the deformed feet of someone who experienced foot binding. Foot binding was practiced mostly in the upper classes of Chinese society, since having it done made it almost impossible to walk and thus impossible to work. Women who had their feet bound were considered more eligible for marriage, since it indicated that they came from a family wealthy enough to not have to worry about whether or not she could walk or work on her own. During the Ming Dynasty, the Chinese began writing novels, or long prose fiction, often that focused on realistic contemporary society. One of the best-known examples was the novel The Golden Lotus. Cao Zhuzhen was a Chinese writer who wrote The Dream of the Red Chamber in 1791, a book still widely considered to be China's most distinguished popular novel. The imperial city was the emperor's palace complex in Beijing, begun by the Emperor Yongle in 1406. It is also known as the Forbidden City, since no one who was not a member of the staff or of the royal family was allowed anywhere near it. The Chinese developed porcelain, a white glazed pottery, during the Ming Dynasty. Europeans particularly liked the blue and white designs that were developed on porcelain. By 1500, the centralized power of the Japanese shogun had essentially collapsed. Nobles dominated their territories and acted as independent warlords. These nobles were called daimyo, the heads of Japanese noble families. Oda Nobunaga took control of the Japanese capital, Kyoto, in 1568. Though he never took the title of shogun himself, he put the shogun under his control and consolidated his rule of central Japan. Oda Nobunaga was followed by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a farmer's son who became a military commander and eventually took control of the Japanese government. He moved the capital to Osaka in 1590 and convinced most of the daimyo to accept his authority. Tokugawa Ieyasu was the daimyo of Edo, who took control of Japan following the death of Toyotomi in 1598. Of the three unifiers, Tokugawa was the only one to take the title of shogun, which he did in 1603. The Tokugawa family restored central authority to Japan, moved the capital to Edo, which is present-day Tokyo, and ruled Japan until 1868, era known as the Great Peace. Tokugawa Ieyasu was the only one of the three unifiers who took the title of shogun. These traders first arrived in 1543. The Japanese welcomed the Europeans and their goods, especially firearms. The first Jesuit missionary, a man named Francis Xavier, followed in 1549. Thousands of Japanese converted to Christianity, though the Jesuit practice of destroying Shinto shrines set many people in the country. Christian activity was actually outlawed by Toyotomi in 1587. Tokugawa would take it one step further and actually expel all Christian missionaries and prohibit European merchants in Japan as well. Only the Dutch were allowed to have a small community in the city of Nagasaki, and they could only trade with the Japanese once a year for a few short months. Francis Xavier, a Portuguese missionary, started the spread of Christianity through Japan in 1549. His missionaries were less than kind to existing Japanese belief systems, though, and Japanese Christians would find themselves ostracized or worse during the Tokugawa era. Under Tokugawa, Japan was divided up into 250 han, or territories, each one ruled by a daimyo. In each han, the daimyo had absolute authority and basically his own private army. To combat this, the Tokugawa shoguns developed the hostage system. Daimyos were required to keep a residence in Edo, where their family had to remain whenever the daimyo returned to his han for any reason. If the daimyo did anything in his han that the shogun disliked, the daimyo's family would be executed. Samurai during the Tokugawa period went from being warriors to being administrators and government officials. Trade and manufacturing became more accepted during the Tokugawa era. People in Japan began using paper money for transactions, and merchants became more powerful. Peasants suffered from declining profits and higher taxes. As a result, there were almost 7,000 peasant revolts and demonstrations during the Tokugawa era. Japan's class system became very rigid during the Tokugawa era. There were 4 distinct classes: warriors, peasants, artisans, and merchants. The warrior class included the shogun, the daimyo, samurai, and ronin, who were samurai who did not have a master. Intermarriage between the 4 classes was prohibited. Beyond the 4 social classes were the etas, the Japanese outcasts. Their lives were severely regulated, including where they could live, what they could wear, and what jobs they could hold. Women were more restricted in the Tokugawa era as well. Men had authority over women's property, their right to marry, and whether or not they could divorce. Women were mostly valued for their ability to bear children and keep the home. Ihara Saikaku was a Japanese novelist who wrote the famous work Five Women Who Loved. Like most literature during the time period, his work was very lighthearted and designed to please the audience. Poetry, on the other hand, was much more serious. Japan's greatest poet was a man named Matsuo Basho, who lived from 1644 to 1694. Basho wrote haiku, 3-line poems with a very strict structure of 5 syllables in the first line, 7 syllables in the second line, and 5 syllables in the third line. Most of his poems dealt with nature in some way, shape, or form. The Japanese also developed a very unique theater style called kabuki that emphasized action, music, and dramatic gestures. There was a fear that kabuki theater would corrupt the nation's morals, and so women were not allowed to appear on stage. Instead, men would dress as women. Here we see some of the bright costumes and amazingly elaborate masks and hair of a kabuki outfit. Korea was ruled by the Yi Dynasty starting in the late 1300s. Korea, unlike China and Japan, was very isolated from the rest of Asia, and in fact was often called the Hermit Kingdom for this very fact. Korea was invaded by Toyotomi Hideyoshi in the late 1500s, and though the Koreans managed to defeat Toyotomi, it left the Yi Dynasty very weak, such that it was conquered by the Manchus in the 1630s. Despite these conquests, European merchants never entered Korea, nor did European missionaries. Korea under the Yi Dynasty was an isolated, solitary kingdom, separated from its neighbors and from incursions of Europeans even after it was conquered by China in the 1630s.